Hello. Okay. I think I'm up and running. Friday night, 9:22. Why I'm starting so late, but it took me extra prep. The Matrix is one of those movies. It's one of the more difficult movies to present in this class because it's the best at reinscribing, well, at appearing to break out of modernity and capitalism while reinscribing it. Much more, but the reinscription is probably the most subtle, um, with the exception, as always, of 2001, which I would say does not have a reinscription unless we see the Star Child as a salvational image, which we're free to do, but it's hardly inevitable. There is something as open-ended at the end of 2001 as there is at the beginning. Uh, what one thought, just to frame what I'm going to be saying about the Matrix, is that the desert of the real is what 2001 opens with. The desert of the real is what exists outside the enfrainment of technology. And on the one hand, Morpheus seems to want to get out of the enfrainment of technology, that the Matrix is the enfrainment of technology, that they're inside the machine and they're literally, and they're fueling the machine, which keeps them imprisoned, at least as it's presented, with their minds flooded constantly with illusory gratification, which sounds like an average day of looking at advertisements. This chip in the head while they're in the vat might as well be YouTube or Facebook or Netflix and chill, or we're surrounded and we're constantly being fed a video stream which offers to keep us tranquil, keep us placid. So they demonize the vat life, if we will, in the Matrix, but they kind of suppress a little bit the degree that it's an accurate allegory of the way we live. And then you might say, well, yeah, that's right. And so the point of Morpheus is to find the one who can break out of the enfrainment. But is there really the, other than wanting to break out of the enfrainment, is there any preparation for what comes next? And there's a hint that it would have to be religious, because the other thing that precedes technology, at least as we know it, is the age of theology, and that does seem hinted at, that the woman is called Trinity, that he's called Neo, and that it's roughly speaking the messianic Christian story, that there had been an engineer or an architect who had helped some of them escape the Matrix, where they set up the city of Zion, which is also from the Bible. He died, but he prophesied that that one would return, Neo, and somehow the oracle seems to be like a kind of John the Baptist that may or may not be predicting that the one has arrived. We know by the very end of the Matrix that the oracle was a program too, but not necessarily Neo. And we're not going to be able to talk about all three movies. I might gesture to the others, but I couldn't have you watch the entire trilogy. The second and the third movie don't really make significant ground further into what we would be if we moved out of the enfrainment of technology. There's a kind of seduction of revolution in the Matrix, the energy of wanting something to rebel against without being sure who you are or what you will be if your revolution succeeds. I mean, we saw this from the balcony, that often the revolutionaries, although they're not aware of this, it's not cynical on their part, but the only end result of revolution is a new people positions of power, because the positions of power are an effective relationship. And yes, the people in power can become corrupt, and that can spur revolution as the corruption creates suffering for people not in power. But when the people not in power who are suffering rise up and resume and take over power, they're now in that same space that eventually corrupted the people who were rebelled against. And certainly the balcony and other things suggest that it resets the clock. There's a lot of utopic, I mean, the French Revolution is case in point. There was the overthrow of the monarchy, or the Russian Revolution, even the American Revolution. Every revolution goes through an intense phase of utopia, which is then it's either gradually corrupted and lost, the Cuban Revolution, or the ideology becomes sufficiently pervasive to obscure the evidence that the revolution has, at least in terms of its own ideals, failed. I mean, the American Revolution was all about liberty, but it also brought in the institution of slavery to underwrite that liberty. So liberty for some, justice for some. And we'll want to bear in mind that The Matrix is a Hollywood movie, and it bears the inflection of American history, not least of all something almost so obvious it's easy to miss, that Morpheus is an African American, and he plays the role of a kind of Moses. So it's not clear why he wouldn't be the one, for instance, but he's put in the position of the one who heralds the one, and somehow, and he's the one who says to Neo, "You're a slave, Neo." And so an African American playing the role of somebody telling a white man that he's a slave, in a way, does point to the circularity of the Matrix, that the crisis is still not that the American economy was built on slavery. The crisis is that economy is failing, and it's failing. It is now finally failing people formerly of privilege. So what I might call the economy of anxiety, the precarious economy, which we're moving into, where most jobs are part-time, not very, especially in the US, not very many benefits. You can be laid off pretty easily, just even setting COVID aside. Unemployment benefits run out quickly. Housing prices are the only thing that seem to have been going up and up during COVID, because there's a lot of capital. It's just not, it's in the hands of the few. So we're getting to a point where owning a house is starting to look almost like like owning a live animal in Blade Runner. It's a sign of extreme luxury, or it will be, and increasingly everyone will have to rent. But then the problem is that if renting is your only option, then the market has one of its barriers to unreasonable rent is removed, and with a lot of lobbying and laws, the keeping rents stable, the rights of the people who rent have been eroded a bit over the last few years. They're still very much present, but it's not that hard to make it impossible for renters to stay, so that where they're staying can be raised and built into yet another condominium. And then the condominiums increasingly are owned by investors and then rented. So even renting the condos will be less and less of an option. And the people who already have houses will own condos that they don't live in. And this was getting so bad in terms of foreign investment that Canada did recently have to considerably raise the percentage of tax on foreign investment, just because the foreign money could come in and buy condos for people who would never even come to Canada, much less live in the actual condos, which meant that rent money was going out of the country in a purely transactional basis, and then that would drive up the price that foreign money could pay for condos was way above market value. So then the market value went up, and when they became out of reach of anyone who might actually live there, and so this situation was getting set up where you were going to have these ghost town condos that would either be empty or occupied by people struggling to pay the rent. So part of the crisis of the matrix is the crisis of white privilege, and in a manner that we've seen in Hollywood since its beginning, it is the knowledgeable black man. This is a situation that goes all the way back to Harriet Beecher Stowe's famous novel Uncle Tom, the black man who is worldly and wise enough to somehow transcend slavery and to apparently offer some kind of overview, because labor is being harvested from Neo's body, but that even when he sits up, that could be confused for a cotton plantation. When he sits up and looks out over vast vats of bodies, it's a horrific image, but it would have been a cotton field where you could look from a certain vantage point and see hundreds and hundreds of slaves, labor being extracted from their bodies to run the machinery of capitalism. It's not the machines that took over the world, it's capitalism. And the machines are an allegory for capitalism. Mr. Smith is corporatism, and he will multiply in the second and in the third. And he is corporations, not just so within capitalism. Shortly after the Civil War, we also gave the status of being a person to corporations. And this was a perversion of an amendment that was intended to make it impossible to ship slaves back to Africa with the idea that they weren't Americans because they had been brought here in chains. And that was one of the thoughts in Reconstruction is, okay, so none of these slaves are going to vote. None of these slaves are citizens. None of these slaves are Americans. And if we can't extract free labor from them, we'd have no other use for them. So they need to be sent back like defective products. So the 13th Amendment was instituted to grant citizenship to people who were born here. And by that time, pretty much there weren't that many slaves who were still originally from Africa. And that somehow helped to close the door. I mean, it identified that the problem is here, where we're going to have ex-slaves in the United States, and then that's going to roll through the generations in some form. Where the Matrix, I think, and Blade Runner 2 is a crisis in whiteness, and that which is presented as an original crisis, but really it's a subsequent crisis to a crisis that doesn't get historicized, which is slavery and the genocide of the natives, although that's often more the purview of horror movies. So let's back up for a minute and notice that since we're on our third genre here, let's talk about how each one deals with money and capital, because when I talk about modernity, I'm talking about the experiential dimension of living within the capitalist structure. So modernity is a broader term, but money and capital, the ability to turn extracted labor into surplus value, which accumulates to someone other than the laborer, is fundamental to capitalism. And the result of that is the laborer is a very vexed relationship to the laborer, because on the one hand, the labor is required, and increasingly in capitalism, consumption is required. So the laborer needs to also consume. I mean, the invention of the weekend, moving to a 5-day week, was partly seen as necessary because the workers had no time to buy anything. And so how could the surplus value of what they were mass producing be sent up to the owners of production if there were no customers. I mean, the workers they needed to buy the products, so that there was a double extraction. First, excess labor was extracted in the sense that the value their labor produced was not returned to them in equal measure. So if if their labor created a unit of 5, 2 was given back, and 3 became capital and went to the owners of production. But then it became further necessary that something of that 2 also be spent, so it could be put back into the market. Because if the wealthy owners of production are the only ones buying the products, then it's not then you can't generate capital. So there are really two extractions from the body of, what Marx called the proletariat, which is roughly anybody who's not able to make money through owning means of production. One of the primary, almost the only means of production in Canada and the US now, since we don't manufacture, we don't actually make things here, the engine of production is investment, money that makes money, capital that makes more capital. And again, this can only occur well outside the range of working for a salary. So there has been wage suppression at a ferocious rate for the last 20 years, and 30 if you go back. And that in a way makes sense, because wages are wasted money from the perspective of creating surplus value for the owners of production. But if it's the same problem, and first of all, slavery is illegal, and secondly, if nobody has any discretionary income, how is anybody going to buy the results of mass production? And one of the answers, beginning particularly after the stock market, the Wall Street crash in 1929, which really was the first, the wage suppression had been so effective that the market system crashed, because there was an inability for the mass majority of people who were wage-making laborers to buy the products. And so coming out of the Great Depression was a totally new approach to debt. And part of what I call the economy of anxiety and the precarious economy is also the debt economy. That debt was invented and encouraged because it was a way to continue to generate surplus value even as wages continued to be suppressed. So whenever you see these paycheck loan, pay loan places, you're looking at the kind of next. I mean, you may not see many of these places because they like pawn shops. They're in the poorest sections of town. And what they offer to do is give you a loan based on your paycheck. So your paycheck's already not enough, and then you take out a loan to make up the difference. But the interest on that loan can be as high as 18 or even 26% at these pay loan operations, and you're going to have the same problem next month. The problem is your wages, not. So it's not a normal loan where you would take a loan. Let's say you were going to put a new addition on your house, and you take out a loan, and you would pay the loan down, but you use that money to increase the equity in your house. So to a small extent, you invested in your house, and you spend $100,000. Let's make it more reasonable, $50,000 to add a room to the back of the house, and within a year or so, that would probably have raised the value of your house to $150,000. So in a small way, you invested, even though it works, because this is where home ownership is one of the few sources of investment for the ordinary person who even lives paycheck to paycheck, or nearly. because the home is still a generator of capital in the sense that home prices go up. Although that, again, how long can that happen before it can't go up further, and everything I just described can't happen. So the Matrix, Neo's the body of white people, and I don't see very many black people in these vats, if any. I'd have to look more closely at the scene, but it's not ethnicized, which is kind of strange. There seems to be no ethnicity in the Matrix. All the class distinctions, everybody's in a vat now, and that seems to be the crisis. Not that there aren't plenty of people in vats now, but that even the people who formerly owned the means of production, they're in vats now too. So there's something about the history of the Matrix that's off. It starts at the point where white privilege is in crisis, and that becomes the first crisis of humanity. And that's certainly not the experience of the African American. Their first crisis, to put it mildly, was 1616 and the beginnings of the slave trade. But that history is wiped out somehow, or now everybody's a slave. And in a way, that seems that left unchecked, that almost seems to be the end point of capitalism. As Slavoj Žižek, I think, said this originally, and Frederick Jameson has emphasized it, is it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. And the Matrix is no exception, because it imagines the end of the world, but it can't seem to imagine the end of capitalism, because Neo, in some ways, he's the great white hope, and somehow he contains within himself the seeds of a new, and I don't mean this in terms of the Ku Klux Klan, but kind of a new white supremacy. Neo is an action hero after the initial financial crash in the early 90s, just as Superman, who was first conceived in 1933, also white, and arguably the first modern superhero before Batman and Spider-Man and the rest of them. He was a fantasy action figure that came along and had capacity. He lives outside the Matrix. He's from, quote unquote, another planet. And Neo also seems to have supernatural powers, not in the sense of beyond the current Earth. And Superman had a humble alter ego, Clark Kent, who still suffered the travails of modernity. Although the way the Superman myth got set up, Superman's constantly trying to make the world safe for Clark Kent and Lois. But of course, Clark Kent is in love with Lois, but Lois is in love with Superman, who is Clark Kent. But she doesn't know it. Clark Kent can't tell her, because for some reason Superman's anonymity is crucial to maintain. And you'd think if his anonymity was so crucial to maintain, maybe his disguise should be a little more than a pair of glasses. I mean, seriously, that's like, I'm Clark Kent. No, I'm Superman. But you don't know that. You can't tell I'm Clark Kent anymore. And so anyway, action hero, taking action, heroics is always a way to, and Star Wars is also very, very much on point here, because Luke Skywalker represents, in using the Force, represents the non-technological. It isn't until he pushes the computer away and hears Obi-Wan Kenobi saying, listen to the Force, that he's able to drop the bomb down into the center of this technological Death Star, and in its one vulnerable point, and destroy it, while the Ewoks all cheer. Now, in some ways, it's much easier to see that Darth Vader and the Death Star is America, not Luke Skywalker or the Jedi, which seem to be some Arthurian fever dream, where technique with your weaponry is once more important. I mean, they're sort of like gunfighters. They're fighting with swords in an age of automatic weapons, and as long as they've trained in the force, that's their sword is good enough. So there's a nostalgia for feudalism and knighthood. I mean, they're called Jedi Knights after all. And so we see this in science fiction, a kind of longing for craftsmanship, making things by hand. Often the valorized people in a lot of dystopic science fiction are the ones who still know how to make things with their hands, who in fact can survive or recall a time before mass production. So I want to show you that one of the necessities, if we're going to move into an age of debt, and let me point out that the romance genre tries to create a commercial free zone where none of the forces that I'm just described have traction through true love. Horror reconfigures modern capitalism as a monster that creates alcoholism, family dysfunction, murderous psychosis in the case of Psycho, and the money is operating this. So in the horror movie, the idea is to vanquish the effect capitalism has. So the effect is acknowledged and then configured as monstrous, and then the monstrous is defeated, which seems to reset the clock. But what both genres, romance and horror, are worried about is unregulated capitalism, because unregulated capitalism, as a very good documentary called The Corporation made this point, is sociopathic. It's not, even though it's treated like it has the rights of a person, it's not a person. This comes in Blade Runner. It's not capable of compassion. It's not designed to have compassion. It's designed, in fact, to make decisions strictly based on surplus value. So they'll make the replicants because the replicants can have labor extracted from them, but as the replicants take on human qualities, they are quote unquote retired, and the euphemism for this execution is used. But even that can be seen as an allegory that we may all be replicants in the workforce, and if we rebel, we get retired. We can be retired in any numbers of ways. So because in this case, rebelling would be not accepting the dictates of the marketplace as it relates to debt, paying a mortgage, and being on the grid and in various ways. So we're still in danger of being retired if we rebel, because we have discerned in ourselves an aspect that's not being addressed in our role as replicant, that there's something else, there's something more. And that's present very much in science fiction, that there's something missing. There's something wrong with this world. And that's presented to Neo, like you know there's something wrong. And you have a question. And Neo says, what is the Matrix? And he said, you can, there is an answer, although the answer, really, Morpheus's answer to what is the Matrix is that the Matrix is the rise of globalization, corporatism. When Mr. Smith interviews Neo after they take him in the office, Neo works in a cubicle. He's discontent. There's something about using consumption to divert people from their discontent, which operates like an addiction, because it can only promise to alleviate discontent when in fact it winds up deepening. And what you tend to get is this oscillation in modernity between success or failure, satisfaction. Well, I should say, yeah, what you're goal you can achieve in modernity is success, satisfaction, and excess, surplus value. But what keeps interfering with that is failure and debt and a feeling of emptiness. So the satisfaction gives way to emptiness. The success gives way to failure. The surplus value gives way to debt. And usually it can oscillate back. So it can go full circle and you work through the debt and start to climb toward success again. But it's sort of Sisyphean in the sense that you get to the top of the hill with having pushed this boulder, and then the boulder tends to roll over you and go back down to the bottom of the hill because the ultimate satisfaction is never there. So right now you guys are pushing your boulder called the grade point average to the top of the hill, and it's exhausting, but it's also organizing. It gives you something to do, something that promises. And I'm not saying it won't deliver. I'm not saying a grade point average is pointless, but like a commodity, the grade point average won't be able to deliver everything that it invites you to imagine. So the grade point average, like a new deodorant or something else, promises more than it can deliver. So which doesn't mean it won't deliver anything. It just means it'll deliver less. And so often our successes are the prelude to a sense of failure. The so-called midlife crisis might be an example of this. Is that there's nothing more depressing than achieving your goals. I just made that up. That's kind of that's not. I don't know if that's 100%. That's not exactly true. I mean, it depends. I wouldn't say my achieving my goals has depressed me, but only because I knew that, or I learned when I didn't know, and I didn't always know, that they were less than they purported to be. And as long as I was kind of aware of that and prepared for that. So I didn't fall too much into the trap of if I could just get into an Ivy League school, if I could just get into a top grad school, if I could just get a tenure stream job, if I could just get tenure, if I could just be a full professor. I did all of those. And at different points, the differential of what I thought achieving that would give me and what it gave me were tended, as I got older, there was less of an issue because I learned. But not everybody learns. You can get trapped in the cycle of thinking that, okay, this success somehow was a washout. This commodity that I bought isn't that great when I brought it home. The next one will be better. And the trick here, and this is the problem with binary thinking, is that it sends you around the track in the same way as before. So what you want to do is kind of spiral up instead of circle at the same level. And it's not clear to me that even Neo's rebellion and his planned rebellion, it's still inside the enframement of technology. And that will be borne out in the second and third movie, where they begin to realize that the world, most of them can't survive without the machines. The machines are partly, I mean, the city of Zion depends on the machines to have fresh air, for instance. So more of a truce is kind of forged by the end of the third, which gives you or me the unsettling feeling that we've spent 7 hours in a trilogy only to return to a truce that preceded the war that created the world of the vat, but which isn't significantly different. It's just earlier. I still feel like we're on the same cycle of something repeating itself. Only 2001, and only the first part of it, Dawn of Man, shows a world that's pre-technological, and that's what the desert of the real is. Reality came about as the result of a technological enframement, which Kubrick makes clear: the raising of the bone, the bringing down of the bone, the discovery of the tool/weapon. That created time, that created space, that created ownership, capital, money, and a particular kind of desire that both strives for complete gratification and is driven by the fact that it will never achieve that. But then there's a very powerful engine there, that the drive to achieve complete satisfaction outlasts any amount of failures to achieve it. The drive it's an overdrive. And I'm not even saying it's not necessarily a bad thing, except that anxiety and depression can creep in when success tips over into failure with a promise of a new success, which tips over into failure with the promise of a new success. And sometimes you can tolerate that pace, but if you I'll use this term deliberately, if you overinvest in reaching that ultimate satisfaction, the failures will begin to erode. And also, if you, this is where melodrama, a genre we didn't cover, is an important genre. So I hope you take the second half of this class, because the melodrama reminds you also, be careful how you define success, because it's very easy to lose things you need on the way to a success you don't. Only to it, and then the other reason that achieving your goal becomes depressing is that you realize it wasn't actually your goal. I mean, it was part of your goal. It was what other people told you should be your goal. It's what the culture seemed to admire as a goal. But you're there now, and you're lonely. And I want to talk more about this too, and that is the erosion of the social relation in the rise of capitalism. Let me show you this MasterCard commercial. And they call it MasterCard. One of the things I'm going to try and do tonight, and I think maybe we'll need the open class as well, but you've seen me hold this up before, and this is an example of master discourse, where you have the master, the S1, address the S2 and make a demand on the S2, and then the S2 goes into labor to produce, try and attempt to satisfy the demand made by the master, and the surplus value of that product that made in response to his demand goes back to the master. But the master's original demand was really that he not be a split subject, and nothing that the S2 can do, no amount of production, no amount of surplus value, millions and billions of dollars, will be able to resolve the master from being, in fact, a split subject. And given that the enframement of technology creates not just a master-slave dynamic, but a owner of production and laborer relationship and mass production, and then that becomes reality, which is right here, but it obscures the real, which is here. So with the apes, they are living in the real. They're living in the desert of the real, and they don't have no reality. There's no, one day is not any different than the rest. A leopard will either leap, if the leopard doesn't jump on them, they'll get up and eat berries again the next day. There's a water hole that they now own. So that's one card. But what's happened to a certain degree, and we've talked about this in A11 as well, this is something called, and I'll have more to say about this, but this is more of the capitalist discourse. And it's a fundamental shift. Arguably, this is the shift that began with Dover Beach, where the master, the god, the Godot, is failing. And so what rises up in its place is the object of desire. And what gets eradicated is social relation. Unfettered capitalism completely destroys social relation. The master discourse generates frustration, which becomes the basis of social relation. We band together to solve problems that frustrate us all. But commodity culture has increasingly predicated itself on eliminating frustration, eliminating disappointment, eliminating failure, eliminating them. And failure and dissatisfaction are the basis of community. What we are drawn together by suffering. Even when we celebrate together, we tend to celebrate both as a way to shore up community against impending suffering, celebrate our having come through periods of suffering. But in ritual, as opposed to addiction, our celebrations are about navigating suffering with a spirit of community. Addiction eradicates, it seems to eradicate suffering. Something like OxyContin or heroin, the effect of the chemical is to, for the period of time that the chemical is extant, it eliminates suffering entirely. And I think one reason we're in such an age of addiction is we've bought into this mythology that suffering, the point of capitalism and modernity is to eradicate suffering, as opposed to navigate it. It's because it's not about dwelling in it or increasing it or imposing it. It's about navigating. And something that the blues songs understand, going back to my lecture on the bluest eye in the other class, and navigating suffering, not eliminating it or pretending that you've eliminated it, which just drives it underground. And now you have to pretend that you've eliminated it. So I want to show you this MasterCard commercial from a pretty famous ad campaign. Now, you guys would have been pretty young if you're born, but you may still remember the catchphrase, which is, money can't buy everything, and money, and for everything else, there's MasterCard. And this was a very successful ad campaign that showed all the purchases being made by the MasterCard. And then MasterCard appeared to, put itself down, if you will, or minimize itself as nothing except something that the only value of MasterCard, according to the commercial, is that it permits the building of social relations. But really, the ad also, it's not what MasterCard is. MasterCard is a multi-billion-dollar industry which charges interest for these many purchases, and charges both a fee to the one who sells and an interest charge to the one who buys. It's a very brilliant invention, really. So they make money on both sides of any transaction without doing anything. They're not even there. And the money just accrues to MasterCard. And so part of what this ad does is it suggests that you can't have social relations without buying things. And you don't have enough money to buy all the things you need to fully realize all the social relations you want. So that's why MasterCard is here, to give you the full extent of the social relations you crave by allowing you to charge and to go into debt to make the purchases that will allow you to maximize your social relations. Now, the part here that's very flawed is there's no intrinsic relationship between purchasing and social relation. But there are some obvious anecdotal connections. I mean, taking someone to dinner, going on vacation, going to an all-inclusive resort. Certainly we're told these things will aid and possibly increase social relation. And I'm not so sure. I don't think that, I think they may have a rather neutral relationship. I mean, if you're in a bad relationship and you go to an all-inclusive resort, the assumption is you'll have a good time. But the reality, from my experience and friends, is that you take the bad relationship with you. And at best, the problems, maybe they'll be suspended, but they could even be aggravated because now you're in this perfect place. And I've often thought about that when I watch the phenomenon of The Bachelor and The Bachelorette, where the amount of consumption, which is covered by the TV show, is through the roof. And these couples, in a matter of a month, I guess, are apparently fall enough in love to make a lifelong commitments to one another. And apparently, I don't follow it very closely. I think some people may still be married, met on that show. Most have broken up even before the reunion show, and so it doesn't necessarily have a great track record in that regard. But so I think it's neutral, to be honest. I think that the quality of your social relation can neither be enhanced nor diminished, at least at its essence, by your consumption practices. But notice, I'm going to go here and switch my screen. Let me share application screen, Chrome tab. MasterCard. Okay, so I should be sharing MasterCard with you now. And I'll turn up my sound. See if YouTube flags me for using this ad.
Size 4 flowered dress, $45. New color lipstick, $15. Haircut, $25. Autofocus camera, $260. 5 generations in one photograph. There are some things money can't buy. For everything else, there's MasterCard. Accepted all over, even photo labs. Size 4.
Okay, so these are charming commercials. You got to love the violin music that comes with them. Now, the central paradox is, and I'm going to get back on screen. Let's see. If I do this and I stop sharing, I'm back. I think. Who knows? You know, it says that for everything else, there's some things money can't buy, but they've just shown you a commercial of all the things you need to buy to get to the thing that money can't buy. So MasterCard appears to be putting itself in the back seat, but it's actually the driver of all of this. And you can see with each shot, with each purchase, how the credit card is trying to insinuate itself into the desire for social relation. And the irony is that the structures of production and consumption, which get more ferocious all the time, and the rise of corporations erode social relations, which actually sets up the underwriting for consumption, not just on the personal level, because that was discovered in the early part of the century. Make yourself feel better by going to the mall. This is much more sophisticated. This is insinuating itself into a little girl helping her grandfather get up out of a chair, a bunch of the attractive young ladies who might be the next to wed, putting on lipstick, but notice that the lipstick happens to be a MasterCard underneath the lipstick. And we're even told in that final part of the voiceover that you can even, this is back when you had to actually develop film, and so far how long ago this was, although the autofocus camera is $260, that you can use MasterCard at the photo lab as well, but it also, the fact that this is about a photograph, 5 generations in one photograph, priceless. Is that really what's priceless? I mean, certainly anyone would appreciate a photograph like that with 5 generations, but is it the photograph? See, this is what Guy Debord, the theorist, called the age of the spectacle, that our social relations have disappeared into the spectacle. So all the social relations represented by 5 generations gets reduced to this photograph. And again, the photograph doesn't have much to say about, divorces and marriages and passion and betrayal and adultery and birth and death and sickness and mortality. None of it's there. This is where we get into this, where the photograph is the pinnacle, but it isn't. It's simply a way to mark what actually matters. So, at least in the master discourse, you still have social relation. It's vexed, and it's based on lack and discontent, but it does require the social. There's no requirement for the social in the capitalist discourse. There's a void between the self and the other. There, in a pure capitalist discourse, there is no other, and that's in a way what's represented by everybody being in vats. Once again, that Neo thought he had social relations, although they're not worth much. A couple of people come by to buy some kind of hacked software from him that they talk about mescaline or let's go get high. They don't seem all that interested in him, but then say, you look depressed, why don't you come to the party? And then he sees the tattoo of the white rabbit, and he had just seen on the computer screen, of course, follow the white rabbit. Somebody had hacked into the matrix. So the first hack into Neo's apparent world is an offer of social relation, because then he goes to the party and he meets Trinity, who says, "I'm trying to warn you." So part of the what's beyond the matrix is a desire for a return to social relation, and and yet it's not clear that defeating the machines will, return us to that, especially if we see the machines as representing not literally so much machines uh, as the way I mentioned this in other lectures, I forget for which class, the way the local has been eradicated by the global within the geopolitical capitalist structure, that our local is actually is like a chip in our head, because there's nothing about our local life that can't be fundamentally altered by something that happens thousands of miles away. And I gave the example of the ship that went sideways in the Suez Canal. That was like a glitch in the matrix that we actually live in. That just that brief glitch of 3 days, and suddenly Syria was rationing electricity. Um, let's go to another well-known scene in the Matrix, and this is one. I'm gonna let's see. Sorry, let me get this. So I'm gonna go back to here and share the screen. Okay, this time I'm gonna go to this one and share this. So this opens, as I hope you can see, and this is the scene with the woman in red, which is well known. You can see the green light up here. There's a crowd of all types. There's a nun and there's a businessman, and although it is again predominantly white, and so there is a kind of upper middle class tendency in even in these planned stagings that Morpheus is bringing Neo to. And crossing the street, waiting for the light, is, in a way, the movie kind of betrays the point I'm trying to make, which is that we are not only already in the Matrix, but the Matrix is happening. In other words, it's not a chip in our head. It can feel like a chip in our head because we are so starved for social relation, which successful capitalism erodes. I mean, most of the time, when you often hear from people who will say, "I know this sounds weird, but when I got sick, or it was the best thing that happened to me. When I broke my leg in a car accident, it was the best thing that happened to me." And what are they talking about? And often, what they seem to be talking about is that they thought it's the last. Nobody goes out wanting their leg broken, but then it forced them out of their vat. They didn't want to get out. I mean, Neo doesn't want to get out. Cypher wants to get back in, and we'll have to say more about Cypher because I think he's an understudied. It's so easy to toss him out as a Judas, which he is, as a betrayer. He's desperate to get back into the Matrix, and he's willing to betray all his friends to do it. It's a very weird scene because it's not at all clear to me why Mr. Smith would bother putting him back. It's as easy to kill these people in vats as it was for Hal to kill the guys that were in cryogenetically frozen. They're not going to put him back. They're not going to hook him up. He's just refuse. He's just garbage to them. So I don't even understand why he thinks that's going to happen. But Cypher is somebody who misses the capitalist discourse. He's not particularly social, and it's not clear what overtures he made to Trinity, but he certainly feels rebuffed by her, and he's quite jealous of the fact that she's taken a special interest in Neo. He's almost like an incel in the sense that he thinks he deserves Trinity, but he hasn't done anything to attract her interest, but he's deeply resentful that she didn't offer herself to him anyway. And that's part of his motivation for wanting to go on this rampage. So Cypher represents the kind of sociopath that the capitalist discourse can produce. One who buys in completely to the idea that all there is the satisfactions that can be granted to you from the marketplace. I know this steak isn't real and this juice, but this juice is still tasty, and that's what I want. And I want to be rich when you put me back, and I want to be able to buy things. And so partly Cypher's broken in the sense that he's completely given in to the abdication of all social relation and given himself over to the cycles of satisfaction, failure, success, failure that the Matrix generates. Okay, so let's look a bit of this.
The Matrix is a system, Neo. That system is our enemy. When you're inside, you look around.
And one of the nice cinematic qualities of this is Morpheus seems to have no trouble not being jostled by the crowd, whereas Neo's being bumped by everybody walking by. And because Neo is still believes that following directions is the point, and which is why bullets might, in fact, still kill him because he believes in them.
You see businessmen, teachers, lawyers, carpenters, the very minds of the people we are trying to save. But until we do, these people are still a part of that system, and that.
So there's a nice Althusserian moment of interpolation here. The policeman with the shaded glasses, shades of Psycho, writing a traffic ticket because somebody's parked in the wrong spot. This gets back to how does capitalism valorize everything, and it's in relation to the degree that it can be monetized. Social relation in and of itself is non-monetizable, although the MasterCard commercial I just showed you is monetizing social relation, but not even monetizing social relation, monetizing the fantasy of social relation, selling us back a fantasy of a social relation, something that Coca-Cola and Pepsi do, Pepsi generation. I'd like to teach the world to sing in perfect harmony, this globalizing social relation, which is fundamentally false.
Makes them our enemy. You have to understand, most of these people are not ready to be unplugged. And many of them are so inert, so hopelessly dependent on the system that they will fight.
So here comes the distraction, if you will, while Morpheus is trying to explain. This woman comes along who represents desire. Obviously she's a sexy lady in a sexy dress, but she really represents the object of desire. And in a way, Morpheus is going to explain how the lure of capitalism works, which is that this woman looks like someone who could give you complete gratification while you're looking at her anyway. But like any object of desire, she's not what you want, but what makes you want. And the acquisition of her, were that to occur, would cancel out that dimension of what she made you want, which doesn't mean you didn't want the woman. It means that you wanted the woman and you wanted to be totalized and have a kind of permanent satisfaction, which no one person could provide to you. And of course, she's looking and she's at him, which is very untypical of walking on a crowded sidewalk for a woman to go out of her way to make contact when she doesn't know you. We're all enculturated, women in particular, are enculturated to not make eye contact with strangers in a crowded urban setting. But this kind of speaks to the degree that a commodity will act like it wants to be with just you. But that's the effect of advertising.
Were you listening to me, Neo? Or were you looking at the woman in the red dress? I was. Look again.
So the implication is that the satisfaction followed by the fear, the success followed by the failure, the economy of anxiety, that every time you think you might be about to achieve the pinnacle of what you want, it falls away. And this is what gives the capitalist system, not just Mr. Smith in the Matrix, the traction. As long as the lure can be used, as long as an object of desire or a commodity can be generated, which offers you a satisfaction beyond what you're currently experiencing, possibly because it is beyond what anybody can currently experience. It's the oversell in modernity that can be such a problem, plus the absence of social relation. Because as social relation and community dries up, the ability to tolerate deprivation goes down, and the ease with which one is then manipulated to consume as an antidote to the deprivation. So the woman in the red dress, excess gratification, the revolver in your face, excess deprivation, and the best consumers are the ones who do a pendulum swing between full compensation and desperate deprivation, which is also the dynamic of addiction, where you're either high or you're in withdrawal. And then what that essentially does is eradicate any middle ground between the two. And so when he says some of these people are so desperately dependent on the system, that's an addict model. They're not ready. He says they're not ready to be unplugged. They're not ready to tolerate withdrawal. And the drug modernity is a promise of a totalizing satisfaction that is actually antithetical to what makes us human in the first place. Frustration is also an engine of compassion and social relation.
Is it? This isn't the Matrix.
No. It's another training program designed to teach you one thing. If you are not one of us, you are one of them.
What are they?
Sentient programs. They can move in and out of any software still hardwired to their system. That means that anyone we haven't unplugged is potentially an agent. Inside the Matrix, they are everyone, and they are no one. We have survived by hiding from them, by running from them. But they are the gatekeepers. They are guarding all the doors, they are holding all the keys, which means that sooner or later, someone is going to have to fight them.
Someone.
I won't lie to you, Neo. Every single man or woman who has stood their ground, everyone who has fought an agent has died. But where they have failed, you will succeed.
Why?
I've seen.
So you can notice that this discussion is circling around success failure, which I've been talking about the first hour here. And it's a false binary. The other false binary is red pill or blue pill. In a way, Morpheus is also a salesman when he offers the two pills and says, take the blue one and you'll wind up in your bed tomorrow as nothing will have happened, or take the red pill and go down the rabbit hole. In a way, it's not a choice, because what he's saying to Neo is, if you take the blue pill, you won't remember having chosen it. So is it a choice when you don't remember choosing it? And then so he takes the red pill as a kind of endorsement of agency and self-awareness and what we now call being woke, as opposed to going to but it's a false dilemma. Binaries always have within them an implied hierarchy, and the way it's set up, there's no question that the blue pill is the inferior, is the choice of kind of cowardice. And when Cypher wants to go back in, he's clearly being presented as a treacherous coward. But that's only if you don't notice the false dilemma. Is it that extreme that either you live a lie and die never having lived, or you reach total consciousness? It's really Morpheus that sets up a false dilemma, which he presents as a choice for Neo. Now, it's not so unlike the choice that was given to Adam and Eve, as I mentioned this in the Blade Runner lecture, that if you want to stay in paradise, which in this case is the vat, then don't eat the apple. Don't take the red apple, the red pill, stay with the blue sky, the paradise. Is that, you know, is that the wrong choice? I mean, there's so many false dilemmas built into this that there's a way in which what Morpheus presents and what the movie presents misses the point. Like so many genre movies, it reinscribes or allows the system to continue because it offers a solution to it that is much too total. In a funny way, the red pill is just another commodity. It's just another monetizable promise that if you consume this product, this new red pill, it's really not any different than advertising that we've talked about before. That it will give you some transcendent relationship to the Matrix, but that's the whole selling point. The Matrix is always selling you something that promises to allow you to transcend the Matrix, and it may be that, I mean, it's still a diversion from the intractable experience of being mortal, of which doesn't seem to come up. The fact of mortality.
Seen an agent punch through a concrete wall. Men have emptied entire clips at them and hit nothing but air. Yet their strength and their speed are still based in a world that is built on rules. Because of that, they will never be as strong or as fast as you can be.
What are you trying to tell me? That I can dodge bullets?
No, Neo. I'm trying to tell you that when you're ready, you won't have to.
We got trouble.
Okay. We got trouble. Partly Morpheus is also promising a philosophical way out. Despite the originality of the Matrix, it's essentially the same thought experiment that was designed by Descartes in the 1600s, which is, how do I know that what I consider is my reality has not been produced by an evil demon, and nothing that I see or think or believe is actually real? How do I know that isn't true? And that, of course, became the foundation of science, which became the foundation of technology. That understanding that doubt is the only thing you can be certain of, and then you drive that doubt forward until you're either satisfied, or the doubt overwhelms the phenomena around you. So, but that's also that's the technological enframement, and that's really the question here: is we're going to have to go back to the point where the ape discovers the bone. We have to go all the way back to that point to conceive of alternatives. You can't really get out of the Matrix from within the Matrix, the way that Morpheus would like to imagine it. This is still a salvational narrative where a Godot arrives. In this case, Neo discovers that he is Godot, which is an interesting attempt out of that dilemma. Like, I don't have to wait for Godot anymore. I'm the one. I am Godot, but it still locks you into that fantasy of the only way up is the only way through something is to transcend it. When in fact, if anything, it's the other thing that we've unlearned to our own detriment, which is how to work through things, not how to get over them. Okay, so this is another scene. I guess I better go back to me and change. Okay, I have to stop that. Because if I don't, then I don't think you see it. So then I go back to this, and I share the application screen, and I go to this. And this is kind of another a reinscription scene, not unlike when Rachel and Deckard kiss, and that is, kind of out of the blue, we're told that romance and true love is what has convinced Trinity that Neo is the one, as we'll see.
Get up.
I'm sorry, I have to preface this. She's told him he was killed by Smith, and then Trinity says, "I know that you're the one because the Oracle told me that I would know who the one was because I would fall in love with him, and I love you. Now get up."
He is the one.
So the temporary triumph over Mr. Smith. Let me go back to me and cancel. You know what? I'm worried I didn't share that clip because of the way this just did it. But you know what? I'm not going to go back. You'll know the clip. I mean, it's the one where she says, "Now get up," and Mr. Smith. It's funny because it's actually silent. There's no dialogue for the soundtrack, and then the three agents shoot multiple times, but he just says no. And then he holds up his hand and the bullets stop and then they fall to the ground. And then he charges Mr. Smith and bulls into him and inhabits Smith and bursts Smith open, who shatters into a bunch of green mirror fragments. And then Neo is standing there again. And then the other two agents run. And part of it is when he looks down the hallway too, he sees them as code. And so he finally understands the code, and if you understand the base code of something, you can corrupt it and you're no longer subject to it. So what that sidesteps a little bit is what is the code of modernity, what is the code of capitalism, because it is very encoded and encrypted, and breaking the code of capitalism requires a communal effort, but it also, because capitalism is so good at promoting alienation and eroding social relations, and then selling back to us the fantasy of social relations through consumption, it can feel impossible to imagine the end of capitalism, even if capitalism were to bring on the end of the world. All right, I'm going to do one last, I think I have one last clip. Yeah, and this time I'm going to be a little more careful and make sure, I hope to make sure that you actually see it. Share application, Chrome tab, share. I don't know if I did that in the last time. Now, what's interesting to me about this scene is, and this is the scene where Mr. Smith has, and his various agents have come into the workforce and brought Thomas Anderson, his actual name, into the office. And notice that in his triumphant moment, Neo will say, "My name is Neo," or the one, right? The original, not Thomas Anderson. And the scene where it seems you've been living two lives, as Mr. Smith will put it. This is the experience of modernity. We are a split self between the part of us that is striving for totalizing satisfaction and the part of us that is that feels forever frustrated. And again, in a way, Mr. Smith is operating in a position very similar to Morpheus here by posing a false dilemma, saying it seems you've been living two lives, and then he describes both lives and then says one of these has a future and one of these does not. And it's that kind of insistence on the subject remaining divided, because the future that he says that Anderson has is a future within the cubicle structure, the corporate structure, and but if he chooses to try and fully inhabit the other one outside of the matrix, the implication is he has no future at all. But let's look at how this plays out.
It seems that you've been living two lives. In one life, you're Thomas A. Anderson, program writer for a respectable software company. You have a social security number, you pay your taxes, and you help your landlady carry out her garbage. The other life is lived in computers, where you go by the hacker alias Neo and are guilty of virtually every computer crime we have a law for. One of these lives has a future, and one of them does not.
Okay, now let me go back. Hopefully that happened. Now go back to my screen. Neo will go on to say, "Why don't I just give you the finger?" And I thought this scene went on, and then Mr. Smith says, "Well, how are you going to speak when you don't have a mouth?" And this is a scene taken out of Chien Andalou from the other class, where then his mouth disappears. And then this might recall to us the other thing that is being exploited by the capitalist discourse so effectively, and that is that fundamental need to generate a coherent identity, which traditionally, despite its limitations, operated on the master discourse, that we are able to formulate a certain kind of coherency by producing something in response to the demand of the master. And sometimes we're in the position of slave, and sometimes we're in the position of master, and power is an effective relationship, and nobody actually has power. It just depends on where you are in this square. So that's been that traditional formula. But with this, with this new one, in some ways, the fantasy of destroying the matrix is the fantasy of destroying inhibitions, and yet that is the effect of the capitalist discourse. So one of the big differences between a master discourse and a capitalist discourse is that the capitalist discourse removes the prohibitions of the master gaze by putting the commodity, the object of desire, in the place of the master. But then it's the object of desire that drives us, and instead of us pursuing the object of desire, the object of desire demands that we produce in order to approach it. But the problem then is that there's no real relation between self and other. So there's no ability to generate an authentic, with all its problems, social relation that is based on social interaction and not based on fetishizing objects as having somehow provided to us a social relation, which is now we're told by MasterCard is the only way that social relation can be delivered. So I thought maybe I had the ending of this. Let's see. No. Yeah, so I think that's all I've got by way of clips, but that's all right. It's coming up on 10:42. We'll have an open house, an open class on the Matrix on Monday night at 7:30, and I'm gonna put your prompt up on the discussion for the Matrix, and I'm gonna have you see if you have a look at it. At least it's a very short story called "The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas," by Ursula K. Le Guin, who's a science fiction writer as well. And I'm offering it as a kind of harsh, something that presents the dilemma of a culture based on enjoying. It implies that there's always a remainder, and the only way that the enjoyment can seem seamless is if you ignore the remainder. And in that sense, it doesn't seem to have the same promise as the Matrix. In fact, it's closer to 2001 where it demands that we go back to the source of the enframement, instead of trying to pretend that everything that has resulted after the enframement can also be used to eliminate the deprivations of the enframement. Okay, hopefully that hasn't sounded too circular tonight. I'm going to